us know, breathing is essential to life. So even a very brief cessation of breath can result in death. But apart from this, there is another very important function. The breath is a unique function because it can be both involuntary, that is, we continue breathing even when we aren't aware of our breath, as in sleep, as well as we can use our will or our volition to change our breath. And this has many important repercussions. So let's look first at the involuntary regulation of breath. The involuntary regulation of breath is subserved by centers in the brainstem, shown here as purple-pink, which has three parts: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. And they are called vital centers because they are essential for life. In the medulla oblongata, in turn, there are two parts. There is what is called a pattern generator, where the property of the neurons is such that they generate this pattern or rhythmic function of activity, where they continue from, say, inhale and exhale, moving on after exhale back to inhale without any conscious input required. So it's just a perfect pattern generator on its own. And though this set of nerve cells in the medulla are capable of generating the inhale-exhale pattern on their own, it is important that they have controls from outside. For example, if the oxygen in the room in which a person is sleeping reduces a little, it is needed that the breath gets modulated to keep the person in a safety. And this is subserved by a function called, part of the medulla called the integrator, which puts together inputs like what is the chemistry of our blood? Is there too much of carbon dioxide or H ions? Or is the oxygen concentration less? And then the breath is correspondingly modulated. One such example of the inputs which go to the integrator is not the chemistry, but is neural. This reflex is a very interesting reflex called the Herring-Brewer reflex, described way back in 1868. And what does this reflex do? Whenever we take a very deep breath, where the tidal volume exceeds 1.5 liters, then stretch receptors in the bronchi, the bronchioles, and even in the pulmonary parenchyma get activated. And they send a message back to the brainstem to prevent further stretch. This message is sent by the vagus nerve, or the vagi, one on either side, the 10th cranial nerve. Now, why is it so important? This is important because of the functions of the vagus nerve, which are so many and so vital. We all know that the vagus nerve is concerned with sensory and motor functions, but what we normally give importance to in yoga is the parasympathetic activity of the vagus in the autonomic nervous system, where it has a number of vital functions. And we commonly say that it is the nerve which is important for rest and digest, in contrast to the sympathetic, which is fight and flight, and many others, fight, flight, flee, and so on. Also, the vagus has functions in brain-gut communication and in decreasing inflammation. But I'm not focusing on that. I'm focusing now on the sixth point, social interaction. Within the vagus on either side, there is a ventral vagal complex, which has been given prominence by the work of Stephen Porges on the polyvagal theory. While this is open to a little questioning, the polyvagal theory does state that the ventral vagal complex helps us to modulate the muscles in the larynx so that our voice sounds calm and non-threatening, modulate the muscles of the face, particularly those around the eyes and around the mouth, for example, and even of the neck, so that we can keep our head and neck in such a position that our facial expression is, again, friendly, interactive, rather than threatening or aggressive. And in this position and in such a calm sounding voice, social interaction is facilitated. So this is a fascinating theory. And the idea then is that when we activate the vagus, for example, through a deep breath, we are bringing into play not only rest and digest, but also facilitating social interaction. With this, we'll leave aside the involuntary breath regulation and move ahead to the voluntary. Voluntary breath regulation is an important property of evolved species, and it is subserved again by a part of the brain, in this case, the evolved cerebral cortex, shown here in light blue. Here you can see a number of mammalian brains, the more evolved of the mammalian species, and only two of these are able to use their volition to change their breath. One of them, of course, is man, and the other is the dolphin. So dolphins belong to a species called cetaceans or cetaceans, which are actually a Greek word meaning sea monster, and includes whales, porpoises, and dolphins. So if these mammals are able to regulate their breath at will, what are the benefits to them by voluntary breath regulation? The first one is the sound spectrum. Because of the ability to modulate their inhale-exhale, dolphins are able to produce complex sounds, and this has been the object of study to understand communication between these mammals. Apart from this, very fascinating fact about dolphins: they sleep with only one hemisphere of their brain at a time. So we can see here on the lower part of the slide a trace of EEG. On the right side, we can see when the waves are large and under time 1, large waves characteristic of a sleep state 4 are seen on the right. At the very same point in time, time 1, on the left side, the EEG shows low voltage mixed frequency EEG characteristic of the awake state. And in time 2, when it has switched, the right side is awake with low voltage mixed frequency EEG. The large waves characteristic of stage 4 sleep appear on the left side. So we can see that you can switch between one half of the brain and another, which is truly fascinating and allows dolphins, for example, to go through the ocean while being aware of predators, but at the same time being relaxed and asleep on one half of their brain. And indeed, we believe that this is a feature of voluntary breath regulation in man as well, switching from being alert to being able to be relaxed when we want to. But apart from this, there's one more function, and this is based on a study which was conducted at the University of Pierre and Marie Curie in Paris. It's an early study, 1991. And here what was shown was that when one adopts specific respiratory, facial, and postural characteristics, which are very clear for any one emotion, especially for 6 emotions, then even if a person is not feeling that emotion in that point in time, they are able to get into, not just simulate, but get into that emotion even rather realistically. And this is true for 6 emotions. Can we breathe into an emotion when we are not feeling it? Just by changing our breath, can we reach that emotional state? This is true for these 6 emotions and was considered as a very good application for actors, people acting in a film or in theater. We can see that these 6 emotions depicted on the slide are possible to breathe into. They have each a characteristic breath pattern, varying the amplitude of breath, the rate, the duration of the exhale pause, or even the duration of inhale and exhale. And by breathing in this particular way, one can get into the emotion. So we say another possible benefit of voluntary breath regulation is to modify the emotions. So in summary, voluntary breath regulation, a property of cetaceans and of man, allows for vocalization, which is more complex, and better communication, switching from being alert to being relaxed at will, and from changing our breath to modifying our emotions. This has a direct relevance to yoga, as yoga allows us and is considered as the way to, when we are faced with a situation, react to it, to decide not to react, or even to change our reaction. It's very difficult to imagine, but also very useful and very therapeutic. So this is especially so through yoga breathing. And this yoga breathing is known as pranayamas, where they have 2 very important properties. One is there is breath awareness, as we will see, and also there is voluntary breathing, where the volition is used to override the intrinsic rhythm, that is the voluntary regulation, the inhale-exhale pattern generator. Hence, pranayamas all involve voluntary breath regulation and breath awareness. Now, these 2 abilities of changing the breath and being aware of it were studied in a fascinating study, which looked at people who had epilepsy and they were not responding to any drug. So they were pharmacoresistant. And so in order to use some therapeutic brain stimulation, they had indwelling intracranial EEG, electrodes, which were used for EEG recording as well. in addition to the therapeutic use. And this resulted in certain brain activity patterns emerging. And when these people were asked to have episodes of voluntary breath regulation, where they were asked to slow their breath, and other episodes where they were asked to be aware of their breath, the activity patterns emerged, which was characteristic of voluntary breath regulation, and which activity pattern was characteristic of breath awareness. And you can see here that these are the areas. During voluntary breath regulation, it was the frontotemporal and insular cortices, whereas during breath awareness, there were other areas involved, like the anterior cingulate, premotor, insular cortex, and hippocampal cortices. Now, we can see that the areas are distinct and different, as well as there are some areas of overlap. But one feature remains true, and that is that irrespective of whether it's voluntary breath regulation or breath awareness, many of the areas involved in both of the circuits, 1 and 2 shown on the slide, are involved in attention regulation, paying attention. And this is so well linked to the goal of pranayama in yoga, which is a training in attention, how to be aware and controlling one's attention, awareness and attention in a way that makes a person ready for dhyana, for meditation. Dharana and dhyana are the next stages in the Ashtanga of yoga. So through pranayama, we actually regulate our breath, and so we are better in control of our attention. And since both voluntary breath regulation and breath awareness are a part of pranayama, it's very clear to see that attention is regulated by this. Apart from that, each pranayama has its own effects. And this is because some pranayamas influence the rate, some the depth, some the inhale-exhale ratio, and so on. For example, these are the 5 pranayamas I will be covering in the next few minutes. Kapalabhati literally means shining forehead or attention-enhancing pranayama, where the characteristic feature of this breathing practice is a rapid exhale. There have been a number of studies on the effects of Kapalabhati pranayama on attention, and I will mention a few here. The point 2 is the effect of that Kapalabhati practice on what is called the P300, which is an ERP, event-related potential, formed whenever a person is paying attention selectively to a particular stimulus. We can see here from point number 2 on the slide that when a person practiced pranayama, Kapalabhati, at the rate of 2 Hertz, then there was a change in the P300 latency, which reduced, and the P300 amplitude increased after a period of breath awareness. In addition to this, paper and pencil tasks, such as certain cancellation tasks and other tasks which require a certain motor component, also improved following Kapalabhati practice. So we can see that Kapalabhati practice improves attention, different types of attention, mainly selective attention here. And normally when a person is selectively attentive to a stimulus, there is a slight spike in the sympathetic activity. However, here from the HRV result, which we can see as the first point, we see that there was a reduction in the time domain variables like NN50, PNN50, as well as the mean RR interval. Now, time domain variables correlate reasonably well with the parasympathetic activity, and hence this result was interpreted as a withdrawal of parasympathetic. So there was no sympathetic spike, but nonetheless, parasympathetic did withdraw. So we can say that while there was no parasympathetic safe tone during Kapalabhati practice, it did not spike the sympathetic, but it did allow people to be more attentive. What happened then to the blood flow? This has often been a concern during Kapalabhati practice. The blood flow in the case of all humans is very well regulated through autoregulation, where the normal factors which can vary the blood flow elsewhere in the body do not come into play for the brain, but it's regulated very locally according to need based on levels of carbon dioxide. In the case of Kapalabhati, there's been an interest to study it through a transcranial Doppler, which looks at the major arteries like the middle cerebral arteries, as well as the minor blood vessels, which can be measured through functional near-infrared spectroscopy. I'm quoting some studies. Some of these have been done by us, some of them by others. fNIRs was reported in healthy volunteers, a reduction in the oxyhemoglobin. both during and after HFYB, which is the abbreviation or the acronym used for high frequency yoga breathing or Kapalabhati. Also, the transcranial Doppler showed a reduction in all the flow velocities, as well as an increase in the resistance to blood flow in the middle cerebral arteries related to the practice of Kapalabhati. This would indicate that there's no increase in blood flow, which may be expected if one imagines it as a forceful practice causing global increase. In fact, this is attributed to a carbon dioxide washout effect. But it is interesting to note that despite the washout, there's an increase in the ability to pay attention, which has been reported for hyperventilation earlier as well. Moving on to another effect of Kapalabhati. It's interesting to note that this practice actually does cause an increase in the calorie consumption, and energy expenditure increases by 41% during Kapalabhati. Does not remain high after the practice. It's not really incurring an oxygen debt. Maybe this has certain implications for weight loss. We move on to another breathing practice, which is common in yoga. It was first described in 1983. And since then, there have been so many studies on what is the effect of breathing through one nostril or alternate nostrils. The consistent effects are mainly for alternate nostril breathing. So I'm using certain results here on the EEG and on the blood pressure. On the whole, there does not really appear to be asymmetry, like one left breathing doesn't affect the right half of the brain and so on. Rather, there seems to be a slowing of the fast waves, like a lowering of beta amplitude after this practice. So it's calming to the brain. And also one more consistent effect is that the blood pressure in normotensives, that is point A of number 2 in the slide, reduces, there's a reduction. And also in part A, the lower point of the slide, there's a reduction in blood pressure, systolic and diastolic, in hypertensives as well, by an average of 4.24 millimeters of mercury systolic, and even less, 1.56 understandably, of diastolic blood pressure. So these seem to be the consistent effects after several years of research in this area. Moving on. Now, bumblebee breathing, there has been quite a bit of interesting research on the effects of this rhythmic humming. It involves many changes. One is the most characteristic and spoken about is the vocalization, where the person exhales with a humming sound of a bumblebee. This naturally results in a prolongation of exhalation and a slowing of the breath rate. More recently, there have been a number of well-designed studies on the effect of Brahmari and bumblebee breathing on the EEG, as well as on the HRV, and more work in this area would be interesting. I'm also presenting something which is reasonably well known by now. That is, when a person practices humming, or even if a person just forcefully exhales through their nose, the nitric oxide, which is produced in the nasal sinuses, paranasal, is pushed out into the upper airways. So this is nicely shown way back in 2003 and published in 2006 by these authors, Maniscalco, who actually did it as part of a thesis. So here are the sinuses around the nose, and they produce nitric oxide, which has so many important functions, reducing inflammation, helping to fight infections, very relevant in the present pandemic, and also clearing the mucus through mucociliary reaction, which is stimulated by nitric oxide. So this actually happens whenever we hum or when we practice Brahmari or bumblebee breathing with the sound. We're actually pushing out nitric oxide, which you can see is far more on the right part of the slide during humming compared to quiet exhalation shown on the left side of the slide. So each time a person practices, several-fold increase in the amount of nitric oxide into the upper part of the airway. There are many other effects of bumblebee breathing, and this has not yet been shown for Brahmari pranayama. Nonetheless, I present it here. BHASTRIKA is a practice which typically means like bellows of a blacksmith. And some of the most characteristic studies have just reported a decrease in reaction time. So there has been a reduction in the anticipatory responses, where a person jumps ahead of time and moves, say, presses a button even before they receive the warning stimulus, shown in special children people who are healthy volunteers and so on, more research in this area probably would show this effect, which has been shown consistently over more than 10 years with Bhastrika pranayama, and has a number of applications. Like you wouldn't want a person to cross tracks in the traffic by reacting wrongly to a stimulus. So moving on to one more study on Bhastrika, a 1-month longitudinal study from Brazil, one of the first fMRI studies in pranayama, which showed the activation of certain areas, especially amygdala, anterior insular, anterior cingulate, the ventromedial and ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex as well, all of which are involved with modulating affect and reducing anxiety. Indeed, there were questionnaires used to measure anxiety levels following Bhastrika as well, showing a reduction. So Bhastrika then seems to be a practice which helps a person reduce anxiety, possibly through this effects which were demonstrated by this fMRI study. And maybe because of that, they are better in control of their impulses and of their reaction time. Coming to the end, SHEETALI and SITKARI pranayamas, these involve inhale through the mouth. There's a lot of work naturally on nasal versus oral breathing. So this is a form of oral breathing which is recommended. And because of this, perhaps the practices are considered, or often in yoga, to be cooling practices. We actually measured this in the laboratory. There was no such effect on the body temperature, which increased in a very minor way during the practices, not in any way which would be considered non-physiological. On the other hand, there was a slight increase in the oxygen consumption. Again, more research would be needed to understand why. Is it because oral versus nasal breathing is more challenging, so we consume more oxygen? But like many other yoga practices, which have a small, well-defined increase in oxygen consumption, this would also be a way of being a form of minor exercise. And so we can see that the yoga breathing practices have a number of effects on the autonomic nervous system, on the heart, and on the respiratory system, especially on cardiac autonomic tone. It can influence attention and cognition, and this has been brought out in a number of review articles. It can influence the affect, especially anxiety, and even change the cerebral blood flow for a small and distinct time. So this is directly relevant to this presentation in Breath and Mind. And by voluntarily regulating our breath, we are able to bring all these effects into play in a distinct way, depending on which dimension of respiration is altered by the volitional regulation, whether it's the rate, slowing or increasing the rate, the depth, or the change in the inhale-exhale of phase durations. With that, I come to the end of the presentation and say thank you.